are two women in this photograph. You may recognize one of them, the one in the portrait, as Eva Perón, First Lady of Argentina until her untimely death at 33, or as you may have been introduced to her first, the subject of the musical Evita. The woman standing next to her is Maria Eugenia Alvarez, who was Evita's nurse and confidant throughout her battle with cancer in 1951 and 1952. This is a photo of the same two women that I took 67 years later when I visited Maria Eugenia at her family's home in Longshops, Argentina this past summer. She is 92 years old and she remembers everything, including the day of the First Lady's death, on which it was her job as the nurse to relay to the people of Argentina that, quote, Eva Perón, jefa espiritual de la nación, ha entrado en la inmortalidad a las 20:25 horas hoy. Eva Perón, spiritual leader of the nation, entered immortality at 20:25 hours today. Now, if you've seen the musical Evita, those words may sound familiar.
Eva Perón, spiritual leader of the nation, entered immortality at 20:25 hours today.
Those are the first words that we hear in the show. But this is the woman who initially said them. Sitting in her family's home, I asked Maria Eugenia, do you know that your words are in this iconic piece of musical theater and have been repeated around the globe for over 40 years? She smiled, said she was honored, and then she said, I thought carefully about the poetry of the language as I knew my words would be repeated on into the future, and I wanted to do my friend Evita justice. So why am I telling you this? Let me rewind for a second. I'm a director, and this fall I have the honor of directing a new production of Evita at New York City Center. In preparation for that, the show's associate director, Rebecca Aparicio, and I embarked on 3 weeks of research in Buenos Aires, Junín, Los Toldos, and Longchamps, Argentina this summer. We got to interview an incredible array of people, thanks to Danny Mañas, Alejo Vietti, Kristen Blaja, Elena Roger, and Santiago Regulo, who introduced us to folks far and wide. These folks ranged from a silversmith whose father was responsible for the creation of Evita's tomb, to archivists at the Eva Perón Museum, to civilians whose lives had been affected by the Perón's regime in countless ways, good and bad, and to Maria Eugenia. Throughout these interviews, we would ask them about stories about their experiences as they related to Eva Perón. And when we returned to New York, the question that we were most frequently asked by our friends and collaborators was, what was the most important thing that you learned during your time in Argentina? And at first, I would dig up some fact that we learned from a museum or from an archivist. Did you know that Eva, et cetera, et cetera. But the more that I answered the question, the more that I realized that facts weren't the most important thing I learned in Argentina. The most important thing I learned in Argentina came out of an interaction that Rebecca and I had with Maria Eugenia towards the end of our visit with her. She asked us to come stand next to her, and then she said this, I believe that energy is transferred through our hands. I held my friend Evita's hand at the moment of her death on July 26, 1952. And as you embark on the journey of telling her story in New York City, give me your hands as I want to transfer that energy to you. I'm smiling in this picture, but what I'm feeling is the immense weight of a storyteller's responsibility, which is what I want to talk about today. Storytellers like me, and presumably like many of you, are entrusted with stories. That's not my opinion, it's just true. Whether we're being handed the story of Eva Perón or the story of another character, real or fictional, we occupy positions of power in which we are conduits or interpreters for taking stories and sharing them beyond ourselves. And so I believe that how we share them becomes what's most important. In the case of Evita, this feels especially true. It is a story about a country's most important icon, only ever performed outside of the borders of the country that that icon is from. If I were to do an informal survey of everyone in this room, I would gather that for the majority of you, the reason you know who Eva Perón is because at one point you heard of or saw a production of the musical Evita. And I would wager that for the majority of you, though certainly excluding any Argentinians in the room, your feelings about the First Lady, however developed or undeveloped they may be, are shaped by the production you saw and the opinions of its creators. Since the late extraordinary Hal Prince directed Evita on Broadway in 1979, there have been approximately 12 English language biographies and 47 Spanish language biographies published on the First Lady's life. In the 6 years that I've been studying Eva Perón, I've come to understand that the musical is incredibly, incredibly well researched, almost shockingly so. How the writers managed to access and compile all of this information without such a thing as the internet is astounding to me. And yet, the 59 biographies that have come out since then are not simply republishing the biographies written in the 70s. As time moves on, historians and anthropologists are probing deeper, they're asking new questions, uncovering new information, and investigating what it means to ask these questions in certain times. So I think it becomes up to a certain breed of storytellers, to directors, to keep stories alive in a way that allows them to respond to the time and place in which they exist. I'll give you an example of what I mean. When we read Evita biographies in the last 10 years, they almost all suddenly start talking about how in Eva's adolescence there were multiple incidents of sexual assault. Here are some of those incidents. In 1933, these biographies say there were two well-to-do boys who told Eva they were taking her on a road trip to Mar del Plata, and instead they pulled over on the side of the road and raped her. In 1936, there was theater producer Jose Franco, who confronted then 16-year-old Eva and told her that she would lose her job if she did not sleep with him. And if tango singer Agustin Magaldi was indeed intimate with Eva in 1935, as depicted in the musical, he would have been 36 and she would have been 15, a full 21 years his junior and certainly unable to consent. This may seem like new information, but it's not. In fact, Hal Prince, Tim Rice, and Andrew Lloyd Webber were rather ahead of their time when they wrote Evita in the 70s. The lyrics acknowledging the unacceptable age discrepancy between Eva and Magaldi have always been in the musical. Quote, "There was nowhere she'd been at the age of 15. Quote, "You must be quite relieved that no one's told the papers. Quote, "All you've done to me was that a young girl's fantasy." You get the point. But these lyrics hit our ears differently now, much like biographers feel the need to highlight these incidents differently now, unlike the biographers of the 50s who could call Eva a slut and leave it at that. That's why in the production of Evita that I'm directing at City Center this fall, we're going to have Eva and young Eva, the latter a teenager playing the role at 15 for the first portion of the show, so that when you hear the words, "There was nowhere she'd been at the age of 15, you see what that means. You see what that means in relation to the man she's standing next to, and you see what that means in relation to all the men that she stands next to throughout the course of the piece. It is also so that we can investigate how that affects her later triumphs and the criticism that it is levied against her. And with a nod to Hal Prince's original idea for staging, it is so that we can investigate what it means that this extraordinary woman has this traumatized child inside of her. But I'm not here to try to sell you tickets to my show, though I really hope you come. But I am here to say that Maria Eugenia and this process have taught me something rather life-changing about what it means to be a director. That no matter whose story I'm telling, I must feel the weight of my responsibility as a storyteller. I must do my homework, and I must investigate what it means to be telling the story at the time and in the place that I am telling it. This feels self-evident, but I don't think that it is. Lest that sound like a lofty statement, I'm going to give you an example of what I mean in the form of a video. In this video, you're going to see clips from two different productions of Evita, and there are two things I'd like you to keep in mind as you're watching. The first is that this is a clip of a musical number from the show called The New Argentina. It ends Evita's Act 1, and in so doing, it chronicles the 1945 presidential election of Juan Perón. The second thing to keep in mind is that Argentine women did not get the right to vote until 2 years later in 1947, so they could not vote in the 1945 election. Watch closely. This scene takes place in 1945. Argentine women didn't get the right to vote until 1947. And yet, these women are singing the lyrics about the votes for women that they do not have, as in these productions, they are staged to drop ballots in ballot boxes. I want to be clear that the text could not be more historically accurate here, and many productions do not make this mistake, but many do. This may seem like a small oversight, but it has ripple effects on the storytelling in myriad ways. It is well known that Eva Perón died of cancer at the age of 33, but it is not well known that she repeatedly refused treatment. That her mother had had the same kind of cancer, and it had been eradicated with a hysterectomy, and when she was offered the same treatment, she refused it multiple times. When I got to meet Maria Eugenia, I was dying to know why. I thought surely the woman who was by Evita's side throughout her many refusals would have an answer to it. And so when I asked her, her answer was somewhat unexpected. She said that when Evita was diagnosed, it was at the onset of the 1951 election, the first in history in which Argentine women had the right to vote, and she saw it as her duty to never rest until the 7.5 million eligible women in her country had exercised their newly granted right, which many did not know that they had or were hesitant to exercise. According to Maria Eugenia, Eva would work often 18-hour days in the throes of her cancer to ensure that this happened. Ultimately, in 1951, in the election, women outvoted men, and in 1952, Eva died. Perhaps it is reasonable to say, in part because of this cause. And yet, if we are not careful, we may depict women happily approaching the ballot box long before she died, in part so that this might be possible. I never want to forget the weight of Maria Eugenia's hand on my own, and what that means for me in terms of my responsibility as a storyteller. I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but I have to say that that moment for me was a rather spiritual or rather historical awakening. After Rebecca and I had talked to Maria Eugenia for over 2 hours, we figured that we'd overstayed our welcome, and I thanked her for her time in order to politely conclude the conversation. I expected her to be relieved and for us to say our goodbyes, but instead, she looked at us and she said, "I'm 92 years old. I might die tomorrow. Are you sure you don't have any more questions?" Of course it was a joke, and of course we all laughed, but of course it was also true. I feel so fortunate to work in an art form in which I must always ask one more question, even when I think I have asked more than enough. When history is offering us answers, who are we to refuse them? Thank you.